Good evening, and welcome to the Sleepy Stories channel. Here you will find peace, comfort, and stories that will help you leave the worries of the day behind. Make yourself comfortable, relax, close your eyes, and let the words transport you to a world of peace and dreams. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it so that you always have a new story at hand for a peaceful sleep. And now, let's begin.
In Elizabethan England, fashion was far more than a matter of beauty or taste. It was the visual language of power, politics, and class. Every ruffle, pearl, and thread spoke volumes about where one stood in society, and stepping outside your prescribed rank could be dangerous. At a glance, a gown could tell you everything you needed to know, not just the wealth of its wearer, but their political allegiance, their ambitions, and even their loyalty to the crown. The Elizabethan world was tightly regulated by sumptuary laws, acts of parliament that dictated what fabrics and colors different classes could wear. These laws were not just about vanity, but control. They preserved the rigid hierarchy of Tudor England, ensuring that no ambitious merchant or minor noble could dress like an earl without drawing suspicion or punishment. Purple silks, for example, were off limits to almost everyone. That shade was so expensive and so deeply tied to imperial dignity that only the queen herself had the right to flaunt it. Cloth of gold and silver-threaded velvets were likewise restricted to the upper nobility. If you were a tradesman with new money and tried to pass yourself off as a gentleman by wearing satin doublets or an embroidered cloak, you risked fines, the confiscation of your clothing, and the mockery of your neighbors. These punishments weren't merely symbolic. They kept the entire social order intact by reminding everyone that fashion was not a personal choice, but a political statement enforced by law. For the court, dress was even more performative. Queen Elizabeth I understood the power of spectacle better than anyone. She turned her body into a walking tapestry of propaganda. Portraits show her covered in pearls, the gemstone associated with chastity and purity, making her the Virgin Queen in visual form. The sheer scale of her ruffs, some wide enough to frame her face like a halo, was a deliberate statement. The Queen was untouchable, radiant, set apart from ordinary mortals. Her courtiers followed suit, competing in a lavish arms race of silks, jewels, and embroidery to curry favor and display loyalty. Thus, Elizabethan fashion was not mere decoration. It was a battlefield stitched in silk. To wear the wrong fabric was to risk your reputation, your fortune, and even the wrath of the queen. Clothing became politics woven into every seam, a constant reminder that in Tudor England, you were what you wore. If one fashion item captures the excess and spectacle of Elizabethan dress, it is the ruff. What began as a modest pleated collar in the early 1500s quickly spiraled into a fashion phenomenon, growing wider, stiffer, and more elaborate with each passing decade. By the height of Elizabeth's reign, ruffs could reach a span so large that the wearer's head seemed to hover on a floating platter. They were impractical, ridiculous even. But that was the point. Only those with immense wealth and leisure could afford to wear something so ostentatious, something that made eating, turning your head, or even breathing freely nearly impossible. The ruff was not just a collar, it was a statement. Constructed from fine linen or lace and stiffened with starch imported from the Low Countries, it required hours of careful ironing, pinning, and arranging. Servants dedicated entire mornings to shaping the folds into crisp perfection. The largest ruffs, sometimes called cartwheel ruffs, could be supported with wire frames, known as support us, essentially little cages strapped around the neck. A misstep at a banquet could leave your elaborate lace collar sagging, an embarrassment that no courtier could afford. Like fabrics, ruffs were regulated by class. The finest lace versions were reserved for the elite, while lower ranks had to make do with smaller, simpler versions. Queen Elizabeth herself weaponized the ruff in her portraits, often appearing with collars so immense that her face seemed framed like the rising sun. This visual dominance was deliberate. Her courtiers, in turn, engaged in a competitive display of ruff size and decoration, each attempting to outdo the other without overstepping the queen's precedence. Ruffs also carried a hidden symbolism. Their perfect circles radiating from the wearer's neck evoked halos, making nobles appear saintly or divine. Elizabeth, who mastered the art of turning fashion into political theater, understood this better than anyone. The Virgin Queen was not merely dressed, she was sanctified, her authority reinforced by lace, starch, and spectacle. To wear a ruff was to advertise your refinement, your resources, and your place within the great hierarchy of Tudor England. To maintain it required patience, servants, and money, luxuries that separated the nobility from the masses. The ruff, then, was the Elizabethan world in miniature, beautiful, fragile, costly, and designed to keep everyone in their proper place. Behind the dazzling fabrics and towering ruffs lay the foundation of Elizabethan style, the corset. Known at the time as stays or bodies, these stiffened garments quite literally shaped the ideal Elizabethan figure. Forget soft curves. What the court demanded was a rigid geometric silhouette. The fashionable body was triangular, broad shoulders tapering down into a narrow waist with the torso pressed flat like a board. This shape was not natural, but that was the point. Clothing in Elizabeth's court was about control, artifice, and the triumph of social order over the chaos of nature. Corsets were usually constructed from layers of linen reinforced with whalebone, horn, or even iron strips. They flattened the bust, straightened the posture, and pushed the body into a stiff cone. For noble women, the corset was essential, for it transformed the wearer into a walking symbol of discipline and status. Servants laced them tightly in the morning, and once inside, movement was restricted. Breathing deeply became difficult, bending forward awkward. Yet this discomfort was precisely what marked elite women apart from the lower classes. Laborers could not afford such impracticality. Their bodies had to remain free for work. At court, however, the inability to bend or breathe freely was itself a mark of privilege. But corsets were only part of the engineering. Beneath their gowns, women wore farthingales, cone-shaped hoops, often made of whalebone, that extended skirts outward in massive circles. Introduced from Spain, the farthingale gave Elizabethan dresses their iconic bell-shaped shape, transforming women into grand architectural structures.
Together with corsets, they created a body that was less flesh and blood than sculpted spectacle. Queen Elizabeth set the ultimate standard. Portraits show her waist tightly cinched, her skirts flaring outward, her torso rigid as marble. The Virgin Queen appeared untouchable, less a woman than an icon draped in power. Courtiers imitated her silhouette obsessively, competing to display the most extreme shapes. Every fold and angle of fabric declared loyalty, discipline, and control, qualities prized in a court obsessed with hierarchy. Thus, in the Elizabethan world, the body itself became political real estate. Fashion reshaped flesh into an emblem of obedience, wealth, and refinement. To lace yourself into a corset was to submit not only to beauty, but to the unyielding order of Elizabeth's England.
If corsets and farthingales gave Elizabethan fashion its architectural structure, then pearls and embroidery provided its language. To step into court was to enter a hall of shimmering surfaces. Gowns glittered with gold thread, doublets sparkled with jewels, and nearly every noble seemed stitched into a tapestry of wealth. But these weren't mere decorations. They were symbols carefully chosen to broadcast meaning, rank, and allegiance. Pearls held a special place in Elizabethan culture. They were the jewels of the sea, expensive to import and time-consuming to harvest. To wear pearls was to flaunt one's ability to buy rarity itself. Queen Elizabeth made pearls her personal emblem. She wore them by the hundreds, strung in ropes around her neck, sewn into her gowns, dangling from her hair, and even embroidered into her shoes. Their milky sheen symbolized purity, reinforcing her cultivated image as the Virgin Queen. Portraits show her almost drowning in pearls, as if purity itself had taken physical form and clothed her body. For her courtiers, wearing pearls was not just fashion, but political theater. To echo the Queen's jewel of choice was to echo her virtue. Embroidery served a similar function, but with even more versatility. A gown might feature stitched roses to honor the Tudor dynasty, pomegranates for fertility, or suns and moons to symbolize constancy. Skilled artisans spent months turning garments into coded texts of loyalty and ambition. Wealthy families hired entire teams of embroiderers to adorn sleeves and bodices with metallic thread, creating wearable propaganda. To walk into court with a gown glittering in gold was not merely to appear fashionable. It was to declare power, stitched into every seam. The cost was staggering. A heavily embroidered gown could equal the price of a London townhouse. Pearls alone were worth fortunes, and their weight on a dress made even standing upright a challenge. But Elizabethan courtiers endured the discomfort gladly. Every glittering stitch was a declaration, "I belong here, among the powerful." In this way, Elizabethan fashion was never silent. It spoke through gems, thread, and shimmer. It told stories of chastity, loyalty, and ambition. To dress richly was to write yourself into the Queen's theater of power, a stage where clothing was not vanity, but a weapon. When we picture Elizabethan fashion, it is easy to imagine only the towering gowns and pearl-encrusted collars of the Queen's ladies. Yet men at court were no less flamboyant in their pursuit of style. In fact, Elizabethan men turned dressing into an art of dominance, using doublets, hose, and slashed sleeves to broadcast power, virility, and allegiance to the crown. The male silhouette of the time was padded and exaggerated. The centerpiece was the doublet, a snug, tailored jacket that extended down to the waist, stiffened with padding to project a broad chest and narrow torso. Underneath, men wore shirts with embroidered collars that peaked above the doublet's neckline, often finished with a small ruff. Some courtiers even stuffed their doublets with bombast, a kind of wadding to give the illusion of muscular strength. Looking strong was just as important as being strong, and in the politics of the Elizabethan court, image was everything. Breeches or hose completed the look. Early in the reign, they were tight-fitting, but as the decades passed, they ballooned outward into trunk hose, short padded shorts that puffed extravagantly around the hips. To modernize, they look almost comical, but at the time they symbolized masculine confidence and aristocratic leisure. These were clothes that made riding, jousting, or dancing look heroic, and they required constant tailoring to maintain their puffed perfection. Then there were the sleeves. Elizabethan men adored slashed and paned sleeves, where outer fabric was cut to reveal the fine silk or satin beneath. This layering was a deliberate show of wealth. Why own one luxurious fabric when you could show off two at once? Bright colors, scarlet, saffron, and deep blue further heightened the spectacle, while jewels and gold embroidery elevated noblemen above the rest. Accessories were equally important. Men wore jeweled hats with tall feathers, carried ornate swords with gilded hilts, and adorned themselves with rings and chains heavy enough to dent a table. These were not frivolities, but markers of allegiance. To glitter at court was to show you had the queen's favor, or at least the resources to pretend. Elizabethan men, like their female counterparts, were trapped in a theater of appearances. Every puffed sleeve and padded chest was a performance, each detail a declaration of loyalty, wealth, and masculinity. The men of Elizabeth's court dressed not just to impress, but to survive, in a world where power was stitched, padded, and slashed into silk. If the gown or doublet was the body of Elizabethan fashion, then shoes, accessories, and cosmetics were the finishing touches that transformed courtiers into living works of art. In a world where appearances were political statements, no detail was too small to overlook. The flick of a feather in a cap or the tint of a cheek could signal loyalty, wealth, or scandal. Shoes in Elizabethan England were often surprisingly simple in shape, but no less extravagant in material. Men favored square-toed slippers made from velvet or leather, sometimes decorated with rosettes or embroidery. Women's shoes were similarly low-heeled, designed more for show than for practicality.
Since skirts often brushed the ground, ladies' footwear rarely had the chance to dazzle. But fine materials and hidden embroidery marked status even where few could see it. For both sexes, shoes symbolized refinement. Practical boots were for the working classes. Accessories, however, where the real competition began. Hats were essential, especially for men. Courtiers strutted through the palace in felt caps or tall crowns adorned with feathers imported from exotic lands. A single plume from an ostrich or peacock was more than decoration. It was a signal of wealth and connections abroad. Chains of office made of gold and hung heavy around the neck carried political meaning. They marked rank and the queen's favor. Even gloves, often perfumed and embroidered, became fashionable tokens exchanged as gifts to secure alliances or flirtations. Cosmetics were equally charged with meaning. Women, and occasionally men, painted their faces with a stark white foundation made of ceruse, a mixture of vinegar and white lead. It created the desired pale complexion that spoke of aristocratic leisure, far removed from the sunburnt skin of peasants. Rouge tinted the cheeks, while vermilion brightened the lips. Some even darkened their eyebrows with soot or coal dust, framing the face like a living portrait. Of course, these concoctions were often poisonous, slowly damaging the skin, but vanity outweighed health in the theater of Elizabethan fashion. Perfume completed the ensemble. Imported from Italy or France, it masked the odor of rarely washed bodies and garments while also signaling sophistication. A whiff of rosewater or musk could distinguish a courtier from the crowd. Taken together, shoes, feathers, gloves, paint, and perfume were not trivial additions, but vital props in the ongoing performance of power. In Elizabethan court, every inch of the body was curated, polished, and staged. Fashion was total theater, and the smallest accessory could tip the balance between favor and disgrace. No one understood the power of clothing better than Elizabeth I. While her courtiers scrambled to keep up with the shifting trends of ruffs, pearls, and embroidery, the queen set the tone for the entire kingdom. She was not simply fashionable, she was fashion itself, the living standard by which all others were judged. Every detail of her wardrobe was carefully orchestrated, transforming her body into a political canvas and her image into propaganda. Elizabeth's portraits revealed this strategy in vivid detail.
She rarely appeared in anything less than overwhelming splendor. Her gowns were mountains of brocade and velvet, stiffened with gold thread and glittering with pearls. Her collars framed her head like halos, while her skirts flared outward in massive farthingales that turned her into a moving edifice. These weren't clothes meant for comfort. They were costumes of majesty, designed to dwarf, intimidate, and inspire. Pearls became her personal signature. By drowning herself in them, Elizabeth cultivated the persona of the Virgin Queen. Purity and chastity shimmered from every gown, yet the sheer volume of pearls also shouted wealth and dominance. No one else could afford such excess, and even if they could, none dared to rival her display. Her use of color was equally symbolic. White and gold suggested purity and divinity, while black projected authority, restraint, and power. In portraits such as the Armada portrait, she appears draped in white and silver, one hand resting on a globe, her wardrobe merging personal virtue with imperial ambition. But Elizabeth's clothing was more than just theater. It was control. She famously bestowed cast-off gowns to favored ladies in waiting, a calculated move that turned clothing into a currency of favor. At the same time, she punished those who dared to imitate her too closely. Courtiers walked a fine line, dressed richly enough to honor her court, but never so splendidly as to compete with the queen herself. Through fashion, Elizabeth projected not just beauty, but near divinity. She transformed her frail mortal body into an immortal icon, commanding loyalty and awe through silk, jewels, and paint. When she entered a chamber, it was less a woman who arrived than a myth in motion. In the Elizabethan court, the Virgin Queen did not simply rule, she dazzled, and in dazzling, she conquered. While Elizabeth and her courtiers shimmered in gold-threaded velvets and gowns heavy with pearls, the vast majority of England's people lived in a world of wool, leather, and linen. Fashion was not a universal playground, but a wall that separated the privileged few from everyone else. Clothing became a daily reminder of hierarchy, stitched visibly into every class from peasant to noble. At the lowest levels of society, dress was purely practical. Peasants wore coarse wool in muted shades of brown, gray, or green, colors that could survive dirt and hard labor. Women tied their hair beneath linen kifs, while men donned simple jerkins and hose. Shoes, if worn at all, were plain leather built for walking fields rather than parading at court. Comfort and survival dictated their wardrobes. Luxury was an alien concept. For the rising merchant class, however, clothing became a battleground. These wealthy tradesmen and artisans had money but lacked noble blood. They longed to imitate the fashions of the elite, purchasing imported silks and elaborate doublets. Yet the sumptuary laws stood in their way, barring them from wearing certain fabrics and colors. To dress above one's station risked heavy fines. Enforcement varied, especially in London, where merchants flaunted their wealth, but the laws existed to hammer home the truth. Money alone did not equal status. Even among the gentry, competition was fierce. A country squire might spend recklessly to dress his wife in embroidered gowns, so she would not look shabby when visiting the royal court. Wardrobes became investments, symbols of ambition stitched into sleeves and collars. But these displays carried danger. Too much splendor could draw accusations of presumption, or too little could mark one as unworthy of royal favor. Thus, clothing functioned like a visual census. You could tell instantly whether someone was a laborer, a merchant, or a lord by the cut of their doublet or the fabric of their gown. Elizabethan society valued this clarity.
It kept order intact, ensuring that even without words, people knew their place. In the end, Elizabethan fashion was a mirror of the kingdom itself, dazzling at the top, drab at the bottom, with countless shades in between. Each stitch told a story of privilege or poverty, ambition or obedience. For most, clothing wasn't just what you wore, it was the skin of the class system itself. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, fashion in England had become more than adornment. It was theater, propaganda, and a cage. Every ruff, jewel, and stitch played its part in a performance that reached from the royal palace to the humblest village. Elizabethan clothing dazzled the eye, but its true purpose was to enforce order and remind everyone of their place. At court, fashion was a weapon. Nobles used it to climb higher in the queen's favor, competing to dazzle without outshining her. Men padded their shoulders into exaggerated strength. Women cinched their bodies into rigid cones, and both sexes wrapped themselves in fabrics imported from across the globe. A single appearance at court could bankrupt a family, but without the right attire, entry into Elizabeth's orbit was impossible. Clothing determined who was visible, who was invisible, and who was powerful. For Elizabeth, dress became her crown. She turned her body into a living canvas of symbols: pearls for chastity, suns for majesty, embroidered flowers for fertility and divine right. Her portraits were less about realism than myth-making. When courtiers looked upon her in person, framed by ruffs wide as halos and skirts vast as fortresses, they saw not a woman of flesh and blood, but an icon of power. Through clothing, Elizabeth ruled not only by decree, but by spectacle. Outside the palace walls, clothing remained a marker of hierarchy. The rich merchant, pushing against the boundaries of the laws, still found himself contained by the fabrics he was permitted to wear. The peasant, in coarse wool, carried his place on his back as surely as the noble in velvet. Fashion was not freedom, it was surveillance, a daily reminder of who held power and who did not. And yet the beauty of Elizabethan fashion cannot be denied. The gowns with their embroidery of gold thread and fields of pearls, the men's doublets slashed open to reveal silks of many colors, the dizzying ruffs like clouds around noble faces, all spoke of an age intoxicated by splendor. To live in Elizabeth's court was to step onto a stage where the costumes mattered as much as the lines spoken. In the end, Elizabethan fashion was never just about clothing. It was identity, hierarchy, and politics stitched into fabric. It was the theater of power worn daily by those who ruled, those who served, and those who aspired. Every thread, every jewel, every ruff was part of a grand performance in which the price of admission was loyalty, and the cost of error could be everything. To be pregnant in the Middle Ages was to live inside a world of constant fear and fragile hope. With little understanding of medicine, every stage of pregnancy felt like a gamble. Women and their families turned to the only guides they trusted: superstitions, religion, and tradition. What a pregnant woman ate, what she saw, whom she spoke to, even the phase of the moon, all of these could supposedly determine the fate of the unborn child. Pregnancy was less a private biological event than a public drama wrapped in rules and warnings. One of the strongest beliefs was that the mind and body of the mother directly shaped the child. If a woman looked upon something frightening, it was feared the baby might be born disfigured or monstrous. A sudden shock or upsetting sight could mark the child permanently, a superstition known as maternal impression. As a result, communities often tried to shield expectant mothers from disturbing images, loud noises, or even bad tempers, believing such influences could seep into the womb. Daily life became a careful balancing act. Foods were judged not just for nutrition, but for symbolic power.
Certain fruits or meats might encourage a healthy baby, while others were believed to invite deformity or disease. Women were told to avoid eels, rabbits, or anything thought unclean, since consuming such animals risked passing their traits on to the child. Even bread and wine could be deemed dangerous if not blessed or prepared properly. The heavens themselves were thought to influence the pregnancy. A lunar eclipse was feared above all else, believed capable of causing miscarriage or birth defects. During eclipses, women were often hidden indoors with charms tied around their necks or bellies, anything to block out the moon's shadow. Astrology also played its role, with midwives and families consulting the stars to predict both the timing of birth and the character of the child. In this atmosphere, pregnancy was not simply a physical condition, but a spiritual and cosmic one. Every decision carried weight. Every moment could tilt fate. For medieval women, superstition was not optional. It was a shield, however fragile, against a world they could not control. The womb, in their eyes, was as vulnerable to demons, eclipses, and curses as it was to illness. Among all the saints of the medieval imagination, none was more important to pregnant women than Saint Margaret of Antioch. Her story, passed down in sermons, manuscripts, and miracle collections, read like a divine allegory for childbirth itself. According to legend, Margaret was swallowed whole by a dragon, an image that mirrored the fear of women entering the jaws of labor. Yet she emerged alive and unharmed, splitting open the beast's belly with the sign of the cross. To medieval minds, this was not only a tale of martyrdom, but a heavenly promise. If Saint Margaret could survive the dragon, then mothers too could survive the perils of childbirth. For centuries, her name was invoked in the birthing chamber. Midwives carried small devotional books with prayers dedicated to her, and women often clutched charms inscribed with her image as labor pains began. Sometimes these prayers were read aloud at the bedside, transforming a terrifying moment into a ritual of divine protection. In some places, even reciting her life story during labor was thought to bring relief. It was said that simply hearing her tale could make the womb open more easily, as if her victory over the dragon echoed in the bodies of mothers who called upon her. Saint Margaret's popularity was immense.
Churches dedicated to her sprang up across Europe, and her feast day was observed with special reverence by women hoping for children. Noble women and peasants alike sought her protection, showing that fear of childbirth crossed all social boundaries. Wealthy families might commission painted icons or gilded reliquaries in her honor, while poorer women made do with tiny lead or pewter badges blessed at her shrines. The material did not matter, the faith did. Her role was more than symbolic. It was profoundly psychological. In a world where maternal mortality was terrifyingly common, belief in Saint Margaret offered a sense of control. The pain, the risk of death, and the uncertainty of the outcome were framed not only as medical dangers, but as spiritual battles in which the mother did not fight alone. She fought with the saint by her side. In the medieval birthing chamber, amid candles, whispered prayers, and anxious relatives, Saint Margaret's name became a lifeline. She was the dragon slayer who tamed fear itself, a reminder that even in the blood and sweat of childbirth, divine help might be only a prayer away. If prayer to the saints provided spiritual comfort, amulets offered tangible protection. In the Middle Ages, pregnant women often wore or carried objects believed to shield them from evil forces, difficult labors, or monstrous births. These amulets ranged from precious stones set in silver to humble scraps of parchment tucked into a pouch. Each carried its own reputation, and together they created a shield of charms against unseen dangers. One of the most popular materials was jet, a glossy black stone thought to repel demons and protect against miscarriage. Amber, too, was prized for its supposed power to ward off illness and evil spirits. Wealthier women might wear beads of these stones strung around the neck or sewn into their clothing, while poorer women used polished pebbles, bones, or bits of iron in hopes of achieving the same effect. Iron especially was believed to terrify supernatural beings. A simple iron key tied to the belt or placed beneath the bed could serve as a protective weapon against witches and fairies said to steal or curse unborn children. Written charms were equally common. Short prayers, biblical verses, or magical words were copied onto slips of parchment, folded and worn in a small pouch around the neck or belly. Some contained the names of saints like Margaret or Mary, while others invoked Christ's wounds or obscure Latin phrases that blurred the line between religion and folk magic. To wear such a charm was to carry a piece of sacred power directly against the skin. Animal parts, too, found their place in this system of belief. The tooth of a wolf was thought to prevent premature labor, while a hare's foot, later famous as a good luck charm, was sometimes used to protect against miscarriage. Even feathers, shells, and dried herbs could be bound into amulets, each with its own meaning in the tapestry of superstition. For medieval women, these objects were more than trinkets, they were lifelines. In a world where medical knowledge was limited and childbirth was dangerous, amulets provided a sense of control, something physical to cling to when prayers alone seemed too distant. Whether blessed by a priest or whispered over by a village wise woman, amulets bridged the gap between faith and fear. To step into pregnancy without them would have felt reckless. With them, a woman could at least believe she was guarded, her body armored, not in steel, but in symbols. In the medieval ages, what a pregnant woman ate was believed to shape not just her health, but the very body and soul of her child. Medieval medical texts, sermons, and folk sayings all carried stern warnings about forbidden foods that could twist fate within the womb. While hunger and cravings were seen as natural, indulging them too freely was thought to invite disaster. One common fear was that eating certain animals might imprint their qualities onto the unborn. Rabbits, for example, were to be avoided. Their reputation for timidity sparked the belief that a child born from a rabbit-fed mother might be weak or cowardly. Similarly, eels, slippery, and serpentine were shunned for fear they could cause deformities or illness in the child. Pork and other heavy meats were considered dangerous as well, blamed for difficult births or for producing sluggish, unhealthy infants. Fresh fruit, too, was sometimes suspect. Medieval people worried that eating unripe or sour fruit could sour the womb itself, leading to miscarriage or sickly babies. Grapes and apples might be allowed in moderation, but only if they were ripe and often only if blessed. In contrast, certain foods were recommended for building strength. Almonds, honey, and carefully prepared grains were thought to nourish both mother and child, with purity and balance. Cravings, however, carried their own risks. Medieval law held that if a pregnant woman's craving went unsatisfied, the frustration could mark the baby physically. Birthmarks, strange blemishes, or even deformities were explained as the result of denied desires. If a woman longed for strawberries and was refused, people feared the child might be born with a red stain upon the skin. Fulfilling a craving wasn't just kindness, it was preventative medicine. Husbands and families were often pressured to indulge these whims, believing that failure could scar the child for life. Fasting days imposed by the church complicated matters further. Pregnant women were sometimes exempted, but piety often dictated restraint. Breaking the fast could weigh heavily on a woman's conscience, as she worried whether her disobedience might bring harm to her child. Thus, diet became a negotiation between faith, superstition, and survival. For expectant mothers, every bite carried meaning. Food was never simply nourishment. It was moral, spiritual, and magical. To eat wisely was to guard the womb. To eat wrongly was to risk bringing forth not a healthy child, but a living warning of broken rules. For medieval people, the sky was not distant and indifferent. It was alive with forces that shaped human fate. Stars guided crops, comets heralded disaster, and for expected mothers, the heavens could be both guardian and threat. Pregnancy was thought to be especially vulnerable to celestial influence. and none was more feared than the lunar eclipse.
An eclipse, when the moon darkened or turned blood red, was believed to interfere with the fragile balance of life inside the womb. Pregnant women were warned that if they exposed themselves to its light, their children might be born disfigured, stillborn, or cursed with monstrous traits. To shield against this, families often hurried expectant mothers indoors, shuttering windows and covering mirrors so the malign glow could not touch them. Amulets, keys of iron, knives, or consecrated herbs might be tied to the woman's waist or bed as further protection. Some even urged women to carry sharp objects during eclipses, believing the blade's power could cut through the danger of celestial interference. The moon in its ordinary phases also played a role. Astrological handbooks claimed that conception and birth were safest under certain signs of the zodiac, while others predicted misfortune. A child born under Saturn's influence might be melancholic and ill-starred, while one aligned with Jupiter could be strong and fortunate. Astrologers were sometimes consulted to calculate the best times for conception or to predict the child's destiny, blending superstition with what passed for medieval science. Solar eclipses, too, carried their own dread. Though rarer, they were seen as ominous signs that threatened not just pregnancies, but kingdoms. Chroniclers sometimes connected them with waves of stillbirths or maternal deaths, feeding the belief that the sun itself could curse the womb. Even ordinary stargazing came with warnings. Looking too long at the night sky, some claimed, could draw in spirits or planetary influences that unsettled the child in the womb. Expectant mothers were advised to keep their eyes lowered and their nights quiet, protecting both themselves and their unborn children from unseen cosmic powers. In a world where childbirth already carried immense risk, the heavens added another layer of fear. The stars and moon could not be controlled, but with prayers, amulets, and vigilance, families hoped to shield mothers from the sky's mysterious wrath. If celestial forces threatened pregnancies from above, witches and malevolent neighbors were believed to endanger them from much closer to home. The Middle Ages were steeped in fear of magic, and few areas of life seemed as vulnerable to curses as the delicate state of pregnancy. A whispered word, a hostile glance, or an envious thought could, people believed, doom both mother and child. The most dreaded of these dangers was the evil eye. This superstition held that envy itself carried destructive power. If a pregnant woman drew the gaze of someone jealous, whether a barren neighbor, a resentful relative, or a passing stranger, the child in her womb might wither, deform, or die. To guard against this invisible threat, women wore protective charms, rings etched with holy names, pouches filled with salt or herbs, or even pieces of iron pinned to their clothing. Some even carried blessed candles or sprinkled holy water before entering public spaces, hoping to deflect ill intentions. Witches, too, were feared as active agents of harm. Folklore warned that they could steal unborn children by supernatural means, drawing life from the womb for their own dark purposes. Tales circulated of women who miscarried after quarrels with suspected witches, fueling suspicion and sometimes violence. Midwives themselves often fell under scrutiny, for their deep knowledge of herbs and birth could look uncomfortably close to sorcery in suspicious eyes. To ward off such dangers, ritual precautions were taken. Holy relics, tiny splinters of wood, fragments of saints' bones, or strips of cloth blessed at shrines were tied around the body as spiritual armor. Psalms were recited at the bedside, especially during the vulnerable hours of labor, to drive away any lurking spirits. Some communities even hung protective objects above the doorway, horseshoes, crosses,
or bunches of herbs to keep witches from entering the birthing chamber. But not all countermeasures were sacred. Folk healers offered magical counterspells, advising women to carry wolf teeth, tie knots in red thread, or spit 3 times to repel the curse. Blending Christianity with folk tradition, these practices reflected the desperate desire for control in an unpredictable world. For medieval women, pregnancy was already a perilous journey. The fear that human malice, as much as divine judgment or cosmic influence, could twist fate, made vigilance constant. Whether through relics, charms, or whispered prayers, the womb was defended as a sacred frontier, forever at risk from both the jealous and the damned. When the first pangs of labor struck, a medieval woman was ushered into a world of ritual as much as medicine. The birthing chamber was transformed into a sacred and magical space, where every word and object carried symbolic weight. Here, amid candlelight and whispered prayers, religion and superstition blended into a tapestry of hope against the very real dangers of childbirth. One of the most common rituals was the recitation of protective prayers. Psalms were chanted aloud, invoking divine mercy, while special blessings from saints, especially Saint Margaret of Antioch, were spoken over the mother. In some regions, her vita, or life story, was read aloud during labor, with the belief that as Margaret escaped the dragon's belly, so too would the child escape the dangers of birth. Rosaries were clutched tightly, crucifixes pressed into the hands of laboring women, as if sacred touch could lend strength. Objects carried into the room were just as important as words. Holy relics, splinters of the true cross, bits of saintly cloth, or even consecrated candles were placed near the bed. These relics were thought to repel demons and ward off death, transforming the chamber into a fortress of light. Some families even borrowed relics from local churches, returning them with offerings if the birth went safely. But superstition filled the spaces where faith alone felt uncertain. Knots, for example, were feared to tie up the womb. Midwives carefully ensured that no knots remained in the room. Laces were loosened, hair unbraided, cords untied, so nothing symbolically blocked the child's passage. Doors and windows were sometimes left ajar, not only for air, but to encourage the soul of the child to find its way out. Candles burned steadily. Their flames watched closely. If they flickered or guttered, it was seen as a bad omen. Chants, charms, and folk remedies also played their part.
The birthing chamber, then, was never merely a medical space. It was theater, shrine, and battlefield all at once. Mothers labored not only with their bodies, but with the weight of prayer, ritual, and countless invisible protections. For every cry of pain, there was a whispered invocation, an urgent reminder that in the Middle Ages, no birth happened without the unseen world pressing in. Even with prayers, relics, and amulets, not every pregnancy ended with a healthy child. In the Middle Ages, when something went wrong, when a baby was born with deformities or stillborn, it was rarely seen as a matter of chance. Instead, these tragedies were read as divine signs, punishments, or supernatural warnings. The medieval world was quick to interpret unusual births as omens, and the mother often carried the blame. One of the most feared outcomes was the so-called monstrous birth. Babies born with physical deformities, conjoined twins, missing limbs, unusual markings were described in chronicles and sermons as portents of disaster. A child with 2 heads might be taken as a warning of political strife or the coming of war. A baby born covered in hair could be explained as evidence of bestial cravings, perhaps the result of the mother eating forbidden meats or gazing upon animals during pregnancy.
These infants were rarely seen as individuals, but as messages from God or manifestations of sin. The mother's conduct was often scrutinized. If she had broken a food taboo, failed to pray, or quarreled with a neighbor, her behavior could be blamed for the child's condition. The idea of maternal impression, that a woman's thoughts and experiences imprinted directly on the unborn, meant that even her private emotions were suspect. A moment of fear, anger, or desire could, it was believed, mark the baby forever. Communities treated such births with a mix of horror and fascination. Some infants were baptized quickly, both to cleanse them of original sin and to prevent their souls from wandering unshriven. Others were displayed as cautionary tales, used by priests to warn congregations of moral decay. Rumors spread fast, and what began as a family tragedy could become a public spectacle tied to prophecies or local scandals. But monstrous births were not always framed as punishments. At times they were seen as cosmic warnings, signs of upheaval or divine displeasure with rulers. Chroniclers eagerly recorded them alongside eclipses, famines, and comets, slotting them into a chain of omens that foretold change. For medieval people, childbirth was never just biology. It was a dialogue with heaven and hell, with every anomaly read as a message. To hold a monstrous child was to hold proof that the world itself was unstable, its order fragile, and its mysteries unfathomable. For the medieval woman, pregnancy was never just a private journey. It was a battlefield of fears, hopes, and rituals in which superstition was both shield and compass. Without modern medicine, the risks of childbirth loomed large. Maternal death was common. Infants often did not survive, and explanations for these tragedies were sought in the realms of heaven, magic, and fate. Superstition, then, was not simply ignorance, it was a survival strategy. Every stage of pregnancy came wrapped in rules. Avoid lunar eclipses. Do not tie knots. Do not gaze upon frightening things. Pray to Saint Margaret. Carry an amulet of jet or iron. Eat carefully, lest a careless meal imprint deformity upon the child. These were not random oddities, but a collective attempt to create order in a world where so much felt uncontrollable. Each belief, no matter how strange to modernize, gave women a sense of agency, however fragile. Superstition also created community. Birth was rarely a solitary experience. Families, neighbors, and midwives joined forces in protecting mother and child. The birthing chamber was filled with whispered prayers, protective objects, and watchful companions. Even men, though excluded from the room itself, played their part by fetching relics, commissioning charms, or standing vigil outside. The web of customs gave everyone a role in safeguarding life, turning childbirth into a collective drama rather than an isolated event. And yet these beliefs also weighed heavily. Women bore not only the physical burden of pregnancy, but also the moral responsibility for the outcome. A miscarriage or deformity could be blamed on her cravings, her anger, or her neglect of ritual. What we might call bad luck, medieval communities often saw as fault. In this way, superstition could both protect and condemn, offering comfort while demanding perfection. Still, it is important to see these practices not merely as fear-driven, but as profoundly human. They were the tools available to people navigating uncertainty. Where doctors lacked answers, faith and folklore stepped in. Amulets, prayers, and taboos were not guarantees of safety, but they gave women something to hold on to in moments of danger and pain. In the end, Medieval pregnancy was lived at the intersection of biology and belief. The womb was imagined as a fragile vessel, besieged by demons, eclipses, and envy, but defended by saints, relics, and charms. Superstition was not madness. It was meaning, carved out of fear, stitched into ritual, and passed down as the wisdom of survival. In medieval Europe, childbirth was not just a private family event, it was a spiritual crisis. To bring life into the world was both miraculous and perilous. But it also left the mother marked by blood, pain, and the ever-present fear of death. The Church responded with a ritual known as churching, a ceremony designed to welcome women back into religious and communal life after they had given birth. At first glance, it might appear to be a simple blessing of thanksgiving for a safe delivery. Yet beneath the surface, it carried deeper meanings of purification, control, and the uneasy status of women's bodies in the Christian imagination. For the 6 weeks following childbirth, women were often regarded as set apart. Their laboring bodies had shed blood, a substance long associated with both life and defilement.
This belief, inherited partly from biblical laws in Leviticus, meant that until they underwent a formal rite, mothers were discouraged or sometimes outright barred from participating in sacraments, entering holy spaces, or fully resuming their role in the parish community. To many, the mother was not only physically weakened, but spiritually unclean. Churching was the answer to this tension. Typically performed about 40 days after birth, it marked the symbolic transition from exclusion to reintegration. The woman would wait at the threshold of the church, a liminal space that embodied her temporary separation. There, the priest would greet her, sprinkle her with holy water, and lead her back into the nave, often with her head veiled in humility. She then received a blessing of thanksgiving at the altar, asking for renewed health, protection, and fertility. In some cases, offerings were made, candles, coins, or gifts of food, to seal the ritual with gratitude. Yet even as it restored women to the community, the rite underscored suspicion. Churching implied that childbirth left behind a spiritual stain, one that required ritual cleansing before a woman could again be deemed worthy of worship alongside her neighbors. It was both honor and reminder. Honor for surviving the dangerous passage of childbirth, and reminder that her body was a site of vulnerability and pollution. Thus, the churching of women reveals the paradox of medieval motherhood. Celebrated as life-givers, yet simultaneously treated with caution, regulation, and ritual boundaries. It was not just a blessing, but a statement about how society viewed women, their bodies, and their place in the sacred order. The medieval ritual of churching did not emerge in isolation. Its logic reached deep into biblical tradition, especially the purification laws of the Old Testament. In the book of Leviticus, a woman who gave birth was declared ritually unclean. For a son, she was excluded from the temple for 40 days. For a daughter, 80. During this period, she was forbidden from touching holy things or entering sacred spaces until she presented herself for purification, offering a lamb or dove as sacrifice. Medieval Christians inherited this framework, blending it with their own theology to create a ceremony that echoed these ancient laws while adapting them to Christian practice. Symbolism draped every element of the churching rite. The number 40 itself carried powerful meaning. Just as Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, and Christ fasted for 40 days in the wilderness, so too did the postpartum mother wait 40 days before her ritual return. It was a period of trial, liminality, and preparation for renewal. The 40-day wait emphasized that her body and spirit needed cleansing before she could rejoin the spiritual community. The most potent biblical model, however, came from the Virgin Mary. According to the Gospel of Luke, Mary herself submitted to purification 40 days after Jesus' birth, presenting him at the temple in Jerusalem. If even the Mother of God humbled herself to ritual cleansing, then ordinary women could hardly object. This story gave churching both authority and sacred precedent, though it also reinforced the idea that even holy motherhood carried ritual impurity. At its heart, churching symbolized a tension between gratitude and suspicion. The prayers spoken over the woman were framed as thanksgiving for her survival and the safe birth of her child, yet woven into the rite was an undercurrent of purification, as if the act of giving birth left her spiritually stained. Blood, sweat, and pain so essential to life were interpreted as pollutants to be ritually cleansed before she was welcome again at the altar. Thus, biblical roots gave churching a double edge. On one hand, a recognition of the dangers and sacrifices of motherhood. On the other, a continuation of the ancient idea that women's bodies carried inherent spiritual risk. By grounding the ritual in Scripture, the Church ensured its authority while wrapping the messy reality of childbirth in the language of purity and divine order. While ideas about purity and symbolism gave churching its weight, the ritual itself was grounded in highly choreographed actions. The ceremony typically took place around 40 days after childbirth, though in practice the timing could vary depending on the health of the mother, the customs of the parish, and local interpretations of canon law. What mattered most was the public act of transition from seclusion and impurity to blessing and reintegration. The rite usually began outside the church. The mother would wait at the threshold, often veiled or modestly dressed, a visible sign of her humility and temporary separation. The priest would greet her there, echoing the biblical imagery of exclusion from sacred space. Sometimes he sprinkled her with holy water, a gesture both purifying and welcoming, before leading her inside. In some accounts, she carried a lighted candle, an offering of thanksgiving and a symbol of Christ's light guiding her return. Once inside, the priest escorted her to the altar. She might kneel or prostrate herself while prayers were spoken over her. The liturgy of churching was not uniform across Europe, but it generally included psalms of thanksgiving, petitions for the health of the mother, and blessings for fertility and protection in the future. One common prayer expressed gratitude that God had delivered her from the perils of childbirth, while another asked that she might walk in newness of life. Offerings often accompanied the ritual. A woman might present a wax candle, symbolizing light and purity, or money to the church, a gift of gratitude for survival. These gifts reinforced the connection between personal blessing and communal obligation, turning the ceremony into both a private thanksgiving and a public contribution. The ceremony concluded with the priest's blessing, after which the woman was considered restored. She could once again receive the Eucharist, attend Mass, and fully participate in the spiritual and social life of her parish. For many, this was a moment of relief, even celebration. But the very structure of the ritual, meeting the mother at the door, leading her back inside, cleansing her with water,
emphasized that her body had been suspect, and only the church could remove the stain. In its choreography, churching was both tender and controlling. It offered gratitude and healing, yet framed motherhood as something requiring ritual correction.
Every step of the ceremony reminded the woman and her community that giving birth was not simply natural. It was dangerous, polluting, and in need of sanctification. On the surface, the ritual of churching appeared generous, even compassionate. It was framed as a blessing of thanksgiving, a way for the community to rejoice that both mother and child had survived one of life's most dangerous ordeals. In an age when maternal death was frighteningly common, the very act of returning to church was a triumph. Prayers offered thanks to God for preservation, and the congregation shared in the joy of new life. For some women, churching could feel like a moment of healing, a recognition that their suffering had meaning and that their endurance was worth honoring. Yet woven into this blessing was a darker thread: suspicion. Churching did not only celebrate, it cleansed. The very need for such a rite implied that childbirth, with all its blood and pain, left the mother tainted. Medieval theology often associated bodily fluids with impurity, echoing biblical laws that treated women's bleeding, whether menstruation or childbirth, as contaminating. A mother who had endured labor was therefore seen not simply as exhausted, but as ritually unfit to rejoin the sacred life of the parish until purification had been pronounced. This suspicion reflected deeper cultural anxieties about women's bodies. To men of the medieval church, the female body was paradoxical, essential for sustaining life, yet unpredictable, leaky, and dangerously close to sin. Women were praised as mothers and life-givers, but their generative power was also feared, framed as something that needed careful control. Churching symbolized this tension perfectly, a ritual that simultaneously elevated motherhood as blessed and marked it as contaminating. The mother herself occupied an ambiguous space. She was at once the source of gratitude, thanked for bringing forth new life, and the focus of concern, wati. This ambiguity meant that churching could be interpreted very differently depending on perspective. Some women may have embraced it as a welcome moment of thanksgiving. Others may have felt the sting of being treated as unclean. Ultimately, the rite balanced celebration with regulation. It gave thanks for survival, but reminded everyone present that women's bodies, while necessary, were spiritually risky. In this way, churching revealed not just how medieval Europe honored motherhood, but also how it kept it under suspicion, bound by ritual to ensure control over the mysteries of life and birth. Although churching was performed by priests, it was midwives, neighbors, and kin who shaped the experience of mothers between childbirth and the ritual's completion. Childbirth itself was largely women's work. Midwives were the central figures of this world, trusted attendants who knew the dangers of labor firsthand and carried a blend of practical knowledge, herbal remedies, and religious rituals. Their presence lingered even after delivery, as they helped guide mothers through the 40 days of seclusion leading to churching. Midwives were often the first to remind families about the rite. They instructed mothers on when they could safely rejoin the parish and sometimes accompanied them to the church door, serving as witnesses of survival. Their involvement highlighted the liminal nature of motherhood, between body and soul, between impurity and blessing.
Midwives could also prepare small charms, prayers, or blessed objects for the mother to carry during the churching ceremony, reinforcing the sense that this was as much a protective rite as it was a thanksgiving. Neighbors and family members played their part too. The period before churching was one of restricted mobility. Many believed that an unchurched woman should not cook, fetch water, or touch communal goods for fear of passing impurity to the household. As a result, neighbors sometimes provided food or assistance, ensuring that the mother's temporary exclusion did not leave her abandoned. But this generosity came with an edge. Her seclusion also reinforced social boundaries, reminding her and others that she was not yet clean. Community expectations shaped how women approached the ceremony. For some, churching was a joyful re-entry, a moment to parade their survival and the health of their child before watchful neighbors. For others, it was a moment of scrutiny. Gossip could swirl if a woman delayed her churching or if she seemed reluctant. Such hesitation might spark whispers that she was irreligious, or worse, that she had something to hide. Thus, churching was not just a private blessing, but a communal event, binding families and neighbors into the drama of birth and renewal. Midwives offered continuity, bridging the world of the birthing chamber with the authority of the church, while the community bore witness to a mother's reintegration. In this way, churching was as much about reinforcing social order as about spiritual cleansing. Although churching was performed in practice throughout medieval Europe, it was far from uniform. The ritual's basic structure, thanksgiving, blessing, and reintegration, was broadly shared, yet its details shifted depending on geography, local clergy, and community tradition. These regional variations reveal how flexible the rite could be, adapting to different cultural anxieties about motherhood, purity, and women's roles. In England, the ceremony often retained a strong sense of humility. Mothers arrived veiled, sometimes barefoot, and waited at the church door before being let in by the priest. Offerings of candles were especially prominent in English parishes, where women placed wax tapers at Marian shrines or before the high altar. This reinforced the link between the new mother and the Virgin Mary, creating a model of obedience and piety. In France and parts of the Low Countries, however, churching took on a more celebratory tone. There are accounts of mothers attending Mass in fine clothing, accompanied by female kin, and sometimes even treating the event as a small feast afterwards. In these communities, churching could resemble a rite of social display as much as purification. The woman herself was not only rejoining the parish, but reclaiming her place in its networks of honor and reputation. Germany and Central Europe emphasized protective elements.
Mothers might carry sprigs of blessed herbs, such as rue or vervain, to ward off evil spirits as they entered the church. In some regions, the priest's prayers explicitly asked for protection against witches and demons, reflecting local fears that women and their newborns were especially vulnerable to maleficent forces during this transitional period. In Mediterranean regions, where Marian devotion was particularly strong, churching sometimes blurred into festivals of the Virgin. Mothers brought offerings not only for Thanksgiving, but also to dedicate their children symbolically to Mary's care. This turned the rite into a bridge between the mother's private experience and the wider cult of the Virgin. Even within a single country, practice could differ from parish to parish. Wealthier communities highlighted the giving of candles and alms. Poorer ones simplified the ritual to a brief blessing at the church door. What unified them all was the core assumption. Until the ceremony was completed, the mother remained liminal, set apart from her full role in both church and community. These variations show how churching was never a fixed script, but a living tradition molded by local fears, devotions, and customs. Everywhere, however, the rite communicated the same message. Motherhood was sacred, but it needed supervision, ritual, and reintegration to be made safe. At its heart, churching was not just about blessing women. It was about reminding them, and everyone watching, of where authority resided. In medieval Europe, the church was an overwhelmingly male institution. Priests conducted the ceremony, bishops defined its rules, and theologians shaped the narratives that cast women's bodies as both sacred and suspect. Churching, though directed at mothers, ultimately placed them under the gaze and control of male clerical power. The choreography of the rite underscored this hierarchy. The mother waited outside the church doors until summoned by the priest, symbolically dependent on male permission to re-enter sacred space. Even as the ritual was framed as thanksgiving, the language of many prayers emphasized obedience and humility. Women were often reminded of their duty to raise children in faith, to remain modest, and to accept their place in the divine order. The priest, as mediator, stood between the mother and God, guiding her back into the fold on the church's terms. This dynamic reflected wider medieval ideas about gender. Childbirth was seen as women's primary vocation, but it was also interpreted through the lens of Eve's punishment in Genesis. In pain you shall bring forth children. Churching could thus be read as both blessing and a subtle rebuke, a reminder that female suffering in labor was bound to sin and required ritual management by men. By framing the mother's return as an act of purification, the Church asserted its role in regulating women's most intimate experiences. Husbands, too, played a role in reinforcing this authority. In many communities, it was customary for the husband to escort his wife to the ceremony, signaling not only her reintegration into the parish, but also her return to conjugal life. The ritual marked the moment when marital relations could resume, a reminder that the wife's body was not fully her own, but part of a broader system of family, reproduction, and social order, all overseen by male authority. Yet women were not merely passive. Some embraced churching as a moment of recognition, turning it into an opportunity for public affirmation of survival. Still, the structure left little doubt. The Church defined the terms of her purity, her role, and her return. In blessing her, it also bound her more tightly to a hierarchy that placed men as guardians of both her body and her soul. Although the churching rite was framed and led by men, women themselves were not silent participants. Medieval mothers, midwives, and female kin brought their own interpretations to the ceremony, sometimes embracing it wholeheartedly, other times reshaping it to fit their needs, and occasionally pushing back against the assumptions it carried. Their voices, though faint in the written records left mostly by male clergy, can still be traced in the margins of practice and memory. For many women, churching was a welcome moment of recognition. Surviving childbirth, a trial that could so easily end in death, was worth celebrating. To stand once more in the parish, blessed before neighbors, was a public acknowledgement of endurance and resilience. Some mothers treated churching almost as a second birthday, not for the child, but for themselves. The gifts of candles and alms became acts of agency, a way of marking gratitude in their own terms, even if framed by the Church's ritual. But there were also quieter resistances. In some regions, women turned churching into a festival occasion, gathering friends and kin, dressing richly, and hosting meals afterward. Clerics sometimes grumbled that this transformed a solemn rite of purification into a social party. But from others, it was a chance to reclaim joy and assert their place in community life with dignity rather than shame. Women also blended official prayers with folk practices. A mother might carry a charm blessed by her midwife alongside the candle offered at the altar, weaving together sacred and popular traditions. This layering of belief gave her a sense of control within a framework otherwise dictated by men. Some resisted more directly by delaying or avoiding churching. Records show that not all women rushed to the ritual at 40 days. A few postponed it until they felt strong, while others ignored it altogether, especially in rural areas where clerical oversight was weaker. Though this could provoke gossip or disapproval, it demonstrates that women were not universally bound by the rite's expectations. Through these actions, medieval women transformed churching into more than just purification. They turned it into a stage where survival could be honored, where community could gather, and where female voices, though muted, found subtle ways to shape the meaning of their return. The ritual of churching lingered for centuries, surviving well beyond the Middle Ages and shaping how motherhood was understood in Christian Europe. Even after medieval fears of blood and impurity began to fade, the custom remained embedded in parish life as both blessing and expectation.
Its endurance reveals how deeply the Church's views on women, purity, and control had sunk into the fabric of society. For some, the rite was remembered as comforting. Women in later centuries often spoke of it as a joyful thanksgiving, a chance to publicly mark survival and to rejoin communal life after weeks of seclusion. In Catholic countries, churching was sometimes renamed or softened, framed as a maternal blessing rather than a purification, highlighting the gratitude rather than the suspicion. Yet the shadow of its origins never fully disappeared. The Reformation, too, wrestled with the rite. Protestant reformers criticized it as superstition, seeing echoes of Jewish law or medieval excess. Some communities abandoned it entirely, while others reshaped it into a prayer service of thanksgiving, stripped of purification language. Still, in both Catholic and Protestant lands, the idea that mothers required ritual acknowledgement after birth persisted, showing how difficult it was to separate tradition from theology. The legacy of churching also speaks to the larger question of how societies balance honor and control. On the one hand, it celebrated mothers, giving them a public moment of recognition rare in a world where most women's labor went unseen. On the other hand, it bound them tightly within a system that defined their bodies as dangerous, their sexuality as suspect, and their return to community as something that required clerical permission. By the modern era, churching had largely faded, though traces survive in certain blessing rituals still performed in parts of Europe and Latin America. Today, historians look back on it not only as a curiosity of medieval ritual, but as a window into the paradox of Christian motherhood, revered as sacred, yet burdened with suspicion, celebrated for life-giving power, yet subjected to control. The churching of women was never just about mothers kneeling in church. It was about how a society understood gender, purity,
and power. Its echoes remind us that rituals can both heal and bind, offering comfort while quietly reinforcing the structures of authority that define who belongs and on what terms.